Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of The Military Career of Napoleon the Great by Montgomery Gibbs. Chapter 11, The Battle of Wagram.
The Austrian army, in abandoning the capital of the empire, had not renounced the war, although in 33 days Napoleon had, with one stroke of his sword, cut in two the mass of their armies, and with a second burst opened the gates of Vienna. He was now firmly established in that capital, and master of the main resources of the monarchy, but his work was far from being done, either in Austria or in Germany. A great difficulty remained to be overcome, that of crossing a vast river in the face of the enemy, and to give battle with the river behind him. This difficulty Napoleon had been unable to prevent, and it resulted inevitably from the nature of things. On leaving Ratisbon, he had been obliged to take the route which was shortest, thus keeping the two main divisions of the Austrian army separated from each other. He was consequently obliged to march along the right bank of the Danube, abandoning the left to the Austrians, but securing to himself exclusively the means of crossing from the one to the other. The Archduke Charles was soon tempted to quit the fastness of Bohemia and try once more the fortune of a battle. Having re-established the order and recruited the numbers of his army to 100,000 men, he was soon posted on the banks of the Danube. Opposite were the French, and the river being greatly swollen, and all the bridges destroyed, the two armies seemed separated by an impassable barrier. Napoleon determined to pass it, and after an unsuccessful attempt at Neusdorf, met with better fortune at Ebersdorf, where the river is broad and intersected by a number of low and woody islands, the largest of which bears the name of Lobau. Here Massena had thrown several bridges over the arms of the Danube. On these islands, Napoleon established the greater part of his army on May 19th, and on the following day made good his passage by means of a bridge of boats to the left bank of the Danube, where he took possession of the villages of Aspern and Essling, with so little show of opposition that it became evident that the Archduke wished the inevitable battle to take place with the river between his enemy and Vienna. On the 21st, at daybreak, the Archduke appeared on a rising ground, separated from the French position by an extensive plain. His whole force was divided into 5 heavy columns and protected by not less than 200 pieces of artillery. The battle began at 4 o'clock in the afternoon with a furious assault on the village of Aspern, which was taken and retaken several times, and remained at nightfall in the occupation partly of the French and partly of the assailants, who had established themselves in the church and churchyard. Essling sustained 3 attacks also, but there the French remained in complete possession. At one time Lannes, who defended this point, was so hard-pressed that he must have given way had not Napoleon relieved him and obtained him a breathing spell by a well-timed and terrific charge of cavalry under Bessieres, which fell upon their center. Night finally interrupted the action, the Austrians exulting in their partial success, and Napoleon surprised that he should not have been wholly victorious. On either side the carnage had been terrible, and the pathways of the villages were literally choked with the dead. Just as Napoleon was about to retire for a few hours' rest, he was interrupted by a violent altercation between 2 of his chief lieutenants, Bessieres and Lannes, the former of whom complained of the language used by the latter, his inferior in rank, in giving a necessary order for a charge of cuirassiers and chasseurs, then under the orders of Marshal Bessieres himself. Massena, who was on the spot, was obliged to interfere between these gallant men, who, after having braved for a whole day the crossfire of 300 pieces of cannon, were ready to draw their swords for the sake of their offended pride. Napoleon allayed their quarrel, which was to be terminated next day by the enemy in the saddest way for themselves and for the army. Next morning the battle recommenced at 4 o'clock with equal fury, the French recovering Aspern. But the Austrian right wing renewed its assaults on that point, and in such numbers that Napoleon guessed that their center and left had been weakened for the purpose of strengthening their right. Believing this, he instantly moved such masses upon the Austrian center that the Archduke's line was shaken, and for a moment it seemed as if the victory of the French was secure. In fact, it was extremely doubtful if the Austrian center could withstand the mass of 20,000 infantry and 6,000 horse which Lannes had thrown upon it. The Archduke Charles now hastened to the spot to prevent the catastrophe that threatened his center, and in this critical moment discharged at once the duties of a general and a common soldier. He brought up reserves, replaced the gaps which had been made in his line by the furious onslaught of the French, and while awaiting the execution of these orders, seized a standard and himself led the grenadiers to the charge, while his bravest officers were struck down by his side. Lannes, who also headed his soldiers in person, seeing the Austrian infantry disordered, let loose upon them Bessiers and his own cuirassiers, who, charging Hohenzollerns corps, broke several squares and took prisoners, cannon, and flags. Success now seemed certain, and Lannes sent a staff officer to acquaint Napoleon of his progress and asked him to cover his rear whilst he was advancing in the plain and leaving so large a space between him and Essling. The officer found Napoleon watching the grand spectacle of which he was the director. He did not express anything like the satisfaction he might have been expected to feel at such a communication. The fact was, an unfortunate accident had occurred. At this critical moment, the bridge connecting the island of Lobau was being wholly swept away by means of fire ships sent down the river by the Austrians. Napoleon at once perceived that if he wished to preserve his communication with the right of the Danube, where his reserves still lay, he must instantly fall back on Lobau. The want of troops, however, was not the first consequence of the rupture of the bridge, for the 60,000 already passed over were enough to beat the Austrians. What was most to be regretted was the want of ammunition, a prodigious quantity of which had already been consumed, and of which there would soon be a scarcity. Napoleon therefore resolved upon a painful sacrifice in order not to expose himself to risks which prudence forbade him to brave. Having formed this resolution, in an instant he ordered the staff officer to return to Lannes as fast as possible and tell him to suspend the movement and fall back gradually on the Essling and Aspern line. He was also to recommend the Marshal to be sparing of ammunition. On receiving this order, Lannes and Bessiers were compelled, to their deep regret, to halt in the midst of the vast plain of Marchfield. No sooner did the French troops commence their backward movement than the Austrians recovered their order and zeal, charged in turn, and finally made themselves masters of Aspern. Essling, where Massena commanded, held firm, and under the protection of that village and numerous batteries erected near it, Napoleon succeeded in withdrawing his whole force during the night. The commander had sent earlier in the day to inquire of Massena if he could rely on the possession of Aspern, for as long as it and Essling remained, the safe retreat of the army was ensured. The staff officer who took the message found Massena on a heap of rubbish, harassed with fatigue, with bloodshot eyes, but with unabated energy of spirit. On receiving the message, he stood up and replied with extraordinary emphasis, "Go tell the emperor I will hold out 2 hours." 24, so long as it is necessary for the safety of the army. It was during this exciting retreat that a dreadful calamity befell the army. Whilst Lannes was galloping in front of the line from one corps to another, encouraging the soldiers by his voice and example, an officer who was alarmed at seeing him exposed to so much danger entreated him to dismount for greater safety. He followed the advice, though it was far from his habit to be careful of his life. At that instant, he was struck by a cannonball that shattered both his knees. Bessiers and an aide raised him up and found him bathed in blood and almost senseless. Bessiers, with whom he had quarreled on the preceding day, pressed his weak hand. He was laid on a cuirassier's cloak and carried to a little bridge where an ambulance was stationed. The news soon spread through the army and filled it with sorrow. The surgeon declared his wounds to be mortal. In his frenzy, the brave Marshal called for Napoleon, his friend. The latter observed a group advancing, supporting Lannes on a bier formed of crossed firelocks and some branches of oak. 12 old grenadiers, covered with blood and dust, bore this illustrious warrior along. As soon as the emperor saw it was the Duke of Montebello, he hastened to meet him. The grenadiers stopped, and Napoleon, throwing himself upon his old companion in arms, who had fainted from the loss of blood, in a voice scarcely articulate, said several times, "Lands, my friend, do you know me? It is the Emperor. It is Bonaparte, your friend." At these words, Lannes opened his eyes, till then closed, collected his spirits, and made some attempts to speak, but being unable, he could only lift his dying arms to pass them round the neck of Napoleon. The fear of exhausting the little life still remaining in the Marshal determined the Emperor to leave him. Sometime later, Napoleon visited his wounded friend and conversed with him briefly. "My noble Marshal," said the Emperor, "it is all over." "What?" cried the dying man. "Can't you save me?" He died in delirium some days later in the arms of his chief, who wept over him as he had done at the death of Desailles at Marengo. The French soldiery delighted to call him the Roland of the camp, and Napoleon said it was impossible to be more brave than Lannes. No man could inspire his troops with more confidence than could this brave soldier who had been the companion of the fortunes and glory of Napoleon from the very beginning of his public career. Napoleon had charged Lannes to maintain Essling at all hazards, and he valiantly fulfilled his task. At length, at 9 at night, the sanguinary conflict ceased, the French preserving the position they had occupied in the morning, and the Austrians bivouacking where they were. Both sides sustained an equal loss, from 15 to 20,000 men having been killed or wounded on both sides. Among the Austrians were 4 field marshals, 8 generals, and 663 officers killed or wounded. On the morning of the 23rd of May, the French were cooped up in Lobau and the adjacent islands, Aspern and Essling, the whole left bank of the river, remaining in the possession of the Austrians. On either side, a victory was claimed. In the eyes of Europe, it was a check for Napoleon, accustomed to crush his enemy, to have been unable at this time to drive the Austrians from their position. The situation of the French emperor was imminently hazardous. He was separated from Davoust and his reserves, and had the enemy either attacked him in the islands or passed the river higher up, and so overwhelmed Davoust and relieved Vienna, the results might have been fatal. But the Archduke's loss in these 2 days had been very great, and in place of risking an offensive movement, he contented himself with strengthening the position of Aspern and Essling, and awaiting quietly the moment when his enemy should choose to attempt once more the passage to the left bank and the reoccupation of these stubbornly contested villages. Napoleon availed himself of this pause with his usual skill. That he had been checked was true, and that the news would be heard with enthusiasm, he well knew. It was necessary, therefore, to regain the fame which had surrounded the beginning of the campaign, and he made every preparation for another decisive battle. Some weeks elapsed ere he ventured to assume the offensive. On the 4th of July, 1809, Napoleon at last re-established his communication with the right bank and arranged the means of passing to the left at a point where the Archduke had made hardly any preparation for receiving him. On the 5th of July, at 10 o'clock at night, the French began to cross from the islands in the Danube to the left bank. Gunboats prepared for the purpose silenced some of the Austrian batteries. Others were avoided by passing the river out of reach of their fire on bridges that had been secretly erected by the French. When Napoleon had a river to be crossed, he began the operation by suddenly conveying some determined men to the opposite side in boats. These proceeded to disarm or kill the enemy's advanced posts and to fix the moorings to which the boats were to be attached that were to carry the bridge. The army then passed over as quickly as possible. The first of these operations was the most difficult, in presence of an enemy so numerous and so well prepared as were the Austrians. To facilitate it, Napoleon had large flat boats constructed, capable of carrying 300 men each, and having a moving gunwale to protect the men from musketry, which on being let down would serve instead of planks for landing. Every corps was provided with 5 of these flatboats, which made an advance guard of 1,500 men carried over at once, and the enemy, not knowing exactly where the crossing would be made, could not confront the French with advanced posts in sufficient numbers to prevent their landing. The Austrians, having rashly calculated that Aspern and Essling must needs be the object of the next contest, as of the preceding, They were taken almost unawares by Napoleon's appearance in another quarter. They changed their line on the instant and occupied a position, the center and key of which was the little town of Wagram. Here, on the 6th of July, the final and decisive battle was to be fought. Adding together the troops of Massena, Oudinot, Davoust, Bernadotte, Prince Eugene, MacDonald, Marmont, de Reed, and the Guard, there appeared to be 150,000 men, of whom 26,000 were cavalry and 12,000 artillerymen serving 550 guns, an enormous force, such as Napoleon had never yet mustered on a field of battle, and according to some authorities, such a host as had never been brought into action by any leader. Besides this vast force, Napoleon had with him the invincible Massena, who was then suffering from a fall from his horse, but who was capable of mastering all physical sufferings on a day of battle, the stubborn Davoust, the impetuous Oudinot, the intrepid MacDonald, and a multitude of others who were ready to purchase the triumph of the French arms with their blood. The heroic Lannes was the only one missing. Fate had forbidden him to witness a victory to which he had powerfully contributed by his conduct in this campaign. When the day dawned on the banks of the river, about 4 o'clock in the morning, a most imposing spectacle presented itself to both armies. The sun glistened on thousands of bayonets and helmets, and 70,000 men were already in line of battle on the enemy's side of the river, capable of making a good fight with the Archduke's forces. Seeing Napoleon ride along the front of the lines, his soldiers raised their shakos on their bayonets and cried, "Vive l'Empereur!" The ground covered by the two armies was about 2 leagues in extent. The troops nearest were about 1,200 fathoms from the city of Vienna, so that the towers, steeples, and tops of the highest houses were covered by the numerous population, thus become spectators of the terrible contest then preparing. The Archduke had extended his line over too wide a space, and his former error enabled Napoleon to at once see an opportunity to ruin him by his old device of pouring the full shock of his strength on the center. In fact, so apparently weak was the position of the Austrians at this time that the Emperor, in his bulletin of the engagement sent to Paris, had this to say: "This disposition of the army appeared so absurd that some snare was dreaded, and the Emperor hesitated some time before ordering the easy dispositions which he had to make in order to annul those of the enemy and render them fatal to him." At sunrise, the cannonade commenced upon the two lines. Napoleon, perceiving that the Prince of Rosenberg was moving upon Marshal Davoust, repaired in person to the right wing, which he reinforced with the cuirassiers under General Arrigue, and caused 12 pieces of light artillery to advance upon the flank of the enemy's columns. After an obstinate engagement of 2 hours' duration, Davoust succeeded in repulsing his adversary as far as Neusiedl. While the French army thus signalized itself by success in the beginning of the day, the battle was carried along the rest of the line with great determination. The fire of musketry and cannon was now general on that vast front of nearly 3 leagues, along which 300,000 men and 1,100 pieces of cannon were arrayed against each other. It was a principle of Napoleon's that by concentrating on one point the action of certain special arms that grand effects were to be produced, and therefore it was that he bestowed an immense amount of artillery on the Guard and had kept under his hand a reserve of 14 regiments of cuirassiers. The Emperor now ordered that the whole of the artillery of the Guard, together with all that could be spared by the several corps, advance at a gallop. Just then, General de Reed arrived on the ground with 25 pieces of excellent artillery and solicited the honor of taking part in the decisive movement, to which Napoleon consented. He then sent for General MacDonald, his design being to shake the Austrian center with 100 guns, and then pierce it with MacDonald's bayonets and Nansouty's sabers. These orders were obeyed on the instant. While awaiting the carrying out of these movements, impatient for the arrival of MacDonald and Lauriston, Napoleon rode about the field on his Persian horse of dazzling whiteness, giving orders to his aides constantly. The cannonading had by this time acquired the frequency of musket firing, and everybody shuddered at the thought of seeing the man, on whose life so many destinies depended, struck by one of those blind messengers of death. The 100 guns were now ranged in line and instantly began the most tremendous slaughter ever known to those who witnessed it. Napoleon observed with his glass the effect of that formidable battery, saw the enemy's artillery dismounted, and was satisfied with the correctness of his own conceptions. But artillery was not sufficient to break the Austrian center. Bayonets, too, were requisite. The intrepid MacDonald now advanced at the head of his corps under a deluge of fire, leaving the ground covered at every step with his dead and wounded, still closing the ranks without wavering and communicating his own gallant bearing to his soldiers. "What a brave man!" Napoleon exclaimed several times, as he saw him thus march under the shower of grape and bullets. The Archduke's center, shaken by the fire of 100 pieces of ordnance, retreats, as does also his right. Davoust now shakes the Austrian left wing, and as he does so, Napoleon exclaims, "The battle is won," and so it was. Lauriston, with 100 pieces of cannon, and MacDonald at the head of a chosen division, charged the Austrians in the center and broke through it. The victory was for the French once more. At length, the Austrian army fell into disorder. Their center was driven back 2 or 3 miles out of the line. Cries of alarm were heard. The right wing gave way, and the left soon followed. The rout was now complete. At the close of the battle, there remained 20,000 prisoners, besides all the artillery and baggage in the hands of the French. Napoleon showed all his courage and talents on this day, and was ever in the hottest of the action, though the appearance of his retinue drew on him showers of grape, by which he was repeatedly endangered. From early morning, he was occupied in galloping through the different lines, encouraging the troops by his presence and persuasive eloquence, many being killed by the balls that flew about him. It was observed that the enemy's fire was particularly directed against the emperor, in consequence of which Napoleon was obliged to change his surtout 3 times. The aides-de-camp and officers of the staff were also given to understand that they should keep more at a distance, and the regiments were instructed not to salute the emperor with acclamations at the moment he was passing. On the following morning, after surveying the field of battle, Napoleon went to place himself in the midst of his troops who were about to pursue the retreating enemy. He walked round the bivouacs without either hat or sword, his hands being crossed behind him. And as he talked with the soldiers of his guard, his manner and countenance expressed the utmost satisfaction and confidence. On passing MacDonald, with whom he had lost favor, and who had not followed the fortunes of the emperor for some years, Napoleon stopped and held out his hand, saying, "Shake hands, MacDonald. No more animosity between us. We must henceforth be friends. And as a pledge of my sincerity, I will send you your marshal's staff, which you so gloriously earned in yesterday's battle." The general, pressing the emperor's hand affectionately, exclaimed, "Ah, sire, with us it is henceforth for life and for death." The act was heightened by the grace and goodwill with which it was performed. The same rank was granted a few days after to General Oudinot and the Duke of Ragusa, Marmont, for their eminent services. After the battle, Napoleon recognized among the dead a colonel who had displeased him. He stopped and looked at the mangled body for a moment, and then said, "I regret not having told him before the battle that I had forgotten everything." The Archduke fled in great confusion as far as Znaim in Moravia, abandoning as trophies of his defeat 10 standards, 40 pieces of cannon, nearly 18,000 prisoners, 9,000 wounded, and a great quantity of equipage. The loss of the French, while much less than that of the enemy, was 6,000 wounded and 2,600 killed. Marshal Bessieres was among the former. The French army had to lament the loss of the valiant Lasalle, one of the first generals of light cavalry. His death was greatly regretted both by the emperor and the army. He was considered the best light cavalry officer for outpost duty and had the surest eye. He could take in a whole district in a moment and seldom made a mistake, so that his reports on the enemy's position were clear and precise. He was a handsome man of bright wit, an excellent horseman, and brave to the point of rashness. He first attracted the notice of General Bonaparte at the Battle of Rivoli, when he galloped down a descent to which the fleeing Austrians had resorted to escape, and took some 1,000 prisoners under the eyes of General Bonaparte and the army. From that time, La Salle was in high favor with Napoleon, who promoted him rapidly and took him to Egypt, where he made him colonel. He distinguished himself at Austerlitz and in Prussia. The Imperial Council perceived that further resistance was useless, and an armistice was agreed to its name. Napoleon, on returning to Vienna, continued occupied until October. For the third time, he found himself master of the destinies of the House of Lorraine, which he had accused of ingratitude and perjury before Europe and in the face of history. For the third time, this conqueror, so violent in his menaces, so overwhelming in his reproaches, eagerly received the proposals of those who had provoked the war, whose hopes had been overthrown, and whose resources were destroyed on the day of Wagram. The results of the battle, without being as extraordinary as those of Austerlitz, Jena, or Friedland, were great nevertheless. The announcement of the armistice with Austria put an end, in effect, to all hostile demonstrations on the continent, except in the peninsula, and Germany in apparent tranquility awaited the result of the negotiations of Vienna. A few days after Napoleon had returned to Schönbrunn from Moravia, he narrowly escaped the dagger of a young man who rushed upon him at a grand review of the Imperial Guard, and while in the midst of all his staff. Berthier and Rapp threw themselves upon the would-be assassin and disarmed him at the moment when his knife was about to enter the emperor's body. Napoleon demanded to know what motive had actuated the assassin. "What injury," said he, "have I done to you?" "To me personally, none," answered the youth, "but you are the oppressor of my country, the tyrant of the world, and to have put you to death would have been the highest glory of a man of honor." The youth, a son of a clergyman of Erfurt named Staps, was condemned to death. It is said Napoleon wished to pardon Staps, whose frankness and courage had struck him, and in whom, besides, he saw but a blind instrument of the passions incited by the monarchy. But his orders arrived too late. The young German met his death with the greatest coolness, exclaiming, "Hail liberty, Germany forever, death to the tyrant." The length to which the negotiations with Austria were protracted excited much wonder, but Napoleon, who was occupied incessantly with his ministers and generals and seldom showed himself in public, had other business on hand besides his treaty with the Emperor Francis. His long-standing quarrel with the Pope now reached its crisis, growing out of the Concordat, involving affairs in Spain and Portugal, and finally by a refusal of the pontiff to acquiesce in the Berlin and Milan decrees against England's commerce. On the 17th of May, Napoleon had issued from Vienna his final decree declaring the temporal sovereignty of the Pope to be wholly at an end, incorporating Rome with the French Empire, and declaring it to be his second city, settling a handsome pension on the Holy Father in his spiritual capacity, and appointing a committee of administration for the civil government of Rome. The Pope replied with a bull of excommunication against Napoleon, which finally resulted in the removal of His Holiness to Fontainebleau, where he continued a prisoner, though treated personally with respect and magnificence, during more than 3 years. The treaty with Austria was at last signed at Schönbrunn on the 14th of October, Austria giving up territory to the amount of 45,000 square miles, with a population of 4 millions, and depriving her of her last seaport. Yet, when compared with the signal triumphs of the campaign at Wagram, the terms on which the conqueror signed the peace were universally looked upon as remarkable for moderation. Napoleon afterwards expressed himself as highly culpable in having left Austria too powerful after the affair at Wagram, using the following words on that occasion: "The day after the battle, I ought to have published in the order of the day that I would ratify no treaty with Austria until after a previous separation of the crown of Austria, Hungary, and Bohemia, to be placed on 3 different heads." Napoleon quitted Vienna on the 16th of October and was congratulated by the public bodies of Paris at Fontainebleau on the 14th of November as the greatest of heroes, who never achieved victories but for the happiness of the world. When he reappeared at the palace at Fontainebleau on October 26, 1809, crowned with the victory of Wagram, there was one to whom dark forebodings came. Josephine felt that her fate was sealed. In fact, as a modern writer has said, the immediate result of Wagram was the divorce from the Empress. The first public intimation of a measure which had for a considerable period occupied Napoleon's thoughts came from the emperor himself when he said, in an imperial speech in which he described the events of the past year and the state of France, "I and my house will ever be found ready to sacrifice everything, even our own dearest ties and feelings, to the welfare of the French people."
This concludes today's reading of The Military Career of Napoleon the Great by Montgomery Gibbs. Join us also next week for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.